Good morning, everyone. My name is David Birdsell. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs here, and I am delighted to be the co-host of this conference today, together with the Human Services Council. We are going to be talking today about issues that are of extraordinary importance to this sector. We all know that budgets are tighter than they used to be. We all know that the political climate is more difficult than perhaps at one point it used to be. We all know that private philanthropy is more difficult to come by, and we complain about it all the time. This conference is about moving past a culture of complaint. It is about a celebration of the extraordinary work that this sector does and the effort to develop a muscular response demanding of the people who provide the funding on which we rely that it be available consistent with the benefits that this sector produces. Advocacy, particularly advocacy that focuses on yourself, on your own organizations, on the things that you do, is sometimes very difficult to come by. We tend to be a relatively more modest group, but it is vital. It is vital to educate voters. It is vital to educate the people that they put into office. It is vital to work hand in glove, as so many of you already do, with executive branch agencies that charge you with the responsibility of carrying out their missions. How do we make that palatable? How do we make this case in a way that is consistent with the best expectations of public service? How do we make it with the best data and in a way that is sustainable in a tectonic sense over the course of these next few years? And why do I say tectonic? We are clearly at the federal level, at the state level, and at the city level, looking at budgets and reframing a roadmap that will take us through at least the next decade. Think about that. At least the next decade, in ways that are in many respects fundamentally different from the business as usual models that have already begun to crumble over the course of these last 5 and arguably 15 years. This sector, your organizations, must be a part of that conversation. And if they are not, those tectonic shifts will squeeze these organizations in ways that none of us want to contemplate. And I am thrilled and proud to know that HSC has been developing exactly this kind of model, is bringing together the thought leaders that we have today in this room and that you will see on panels and next door throughout the day. And it is vital, vital, vital that we all think carefully about the good work that will be started here today, but continued over the course of the months and years to come as we begin to try to get the attention that needs to be focused on these absolutely vital issues.
I think as I talk to different people in my different roles about the work that we are all doing, and as was evidenced by the work that organizations did after Hurricane Sandy, the work of the sector is in many ways going very well. We're delivering great services. The business model, not so great these days. It's just not working so well. As the Dean pointed out, government is divesting, reductions in private giving, increased need for our services throughout the society, competing with other interest groups. Public perception of not-for-profits is not so great, and our politicians are not helping us, our friends, whether it's being beat up in the press or whether it's local politicians who are using nonprofit to hide illegal activity. All of this undermines the sector in a very real way. Everybody wants more information, more data, more analysis, more this and more that from us, and that's great. We should be doing that. We should be analytic of our work, but we need resources to do that. You can't run the infrastructure of these organizations unless you actually need more. The not-for-profit sector, as we all know in this room, is large. There are almost 100,000 not-for-profits in the state, about $20 billion in state government contracts, and 1.24 million employees. About 18% of the state's workforce works in the not-for-profit sector. And as I mentioned before, Hurricane Sandy was just one example, one very prominent example of the important work that we all do to help fellow citizens in the city and the state. The Human Services Council is so pleased to be convening this event. It's such an important event. I hope all of you who are human services organizations that don't belong to the Human Services Council join. It is an organization that we all need to carry these conversations forward and to carry other conversations forward, whether they're the inside baseball conversations or whether they're conversations like these, which are to advance the thinking of the sector. The Human Services Council is in the lead in pushing these conversations forward in relationships at the city and the state government level. I'm very, very proud to be a member of the Human Services Council, and I'm thrilled to be the chair of the board. It's been an honor for me to serve in that function.
You know, it takes a very sophisticated funder to fund advocacy. And you heard from David and from Joel why advocacy is important. But these folks, and the folks who are here today from government, from academia, from philanthropy, from the sector, who will be talking, who speak on the panels, really get the bigger picture. Not only how important it is for us to provide day-to-day service to those in need, but how important it is to radically decrease the numbers of people who are in need, which is, I think, our ultimate purpose. I want to give you some of these numbers. More than 2.6 million New Yorkers live in poverty, including 866,000 children. That's a poverty rate higher than the national rate. As of 2011, New York State had the highest income inequality of any state in the nation. The top 5% now have half of all the income made in New York State. Given its degree of inequality, if New York City, this is amazing to me, if New York City were a nation, it would rank 15th worst among 134 countries with respect to income concentration, in between Chile and Honduras. A couple more. In recent years, homelessness in New York City has reached the highest levels since the Great Depression of the 30s. You know those movies we all see, those black and white things, those people huddling along like it's some mythic thing? It is worse now in terms of homelessness than it was then. And finally, in the city, more than 15% of residents were food insecure in 2010, totaling more than 1.2 million people. What the hell is food insecure? Food insecure means that in the richest country in the history of the universe, kids are going to bed hungry. It's a sin. It's unforgivable. And what we need to do as a sector is, while we talk to ourselves constantly, as we're doing in this room, is unite together and have some, as my grandmother would say, chutzpah, and really push the government and push the people to understand that there is a real contract with America, and that contract is to take care of people who can't care for themselves. In this last presidential campaign, neither candidate mentioned poverty or nonprofits. Neither the good guy nor the bad guy. You can figure out who those were. We want candidates in the upcoming mayoral election to pay attention to our issues and insist they have a plan for the nonprofit sector, just like they have a plan for education, just like they have a plan for small business. We have to have a stronger voice if we want to affect real change.
In February of 2011, the Human Services Council launched a media campaign called Who Cares I Do, to highlight the critical role that nonprofits play in the everyday fabric of New York City, and to articulate the sector's contribution to the city's economy, both as an employer and a consumer. This campaign led to new alliances with unions and stakeholders and coalitions, and who are fighting together for a fair and equitable budget solution. And one of the great things about these coalitions is that they bring different partners who have different strengths and different strategies and different skill sets working together where they haven't worked together before. There was a rally, a march that was going on down on Wall Street. And it was the Human Services Council and other nonprofit sector groups and unions. And unions were the group that the Human Services Council hadn't really worked well with before. And so we were doing this march, and it was organized by this joint group. And so when you go down, the streets of Wall Street, the police were there and they had barricades up, and so it was very organized, and people sort of marched down the streets in a very uniform way. And then we got to this point where there was some confusion, and some people started to go into the streets, and so I wasn't quite sure where do you go, so I went into the street also. And so then, they start saying, take over the streets, take over the streets. And the police come, and they're trying to regain control, and they say, get out of the streets or we're going to start arresting people. Now, I'm a social worker, and I'm a black man. When the police say, get out of the street or we're going to start arresting people, I get out of the street. But my colleagues, they stayed there and they really stood up. And one of the great things is that what or our sector doesn't feel comfortable doing, other people will do. And it's this collective action that will lead to change. And what we were able to come up with, that we really shared certain visions and issues. One is that when you're looking at budget solutions, that it's not just the expense side you need to look at, but you need to look at the revenue side. And also that budget cuts disproportionately impact women, children, and people of color. New York is a pioneer in many areas and can be at the forefront of showing the nation how nonprofits can effectively and appropriately engage in politics. So with that as our backdrop, please allow me to introduce our keynote speaker. As a nonprofit leader, Robert Egger has helped hundreds enter the world of work. As a political advocate, he has put pressure on electeds to include the nonprofit sector in their platforms. And as a colleague, he challenges all of us to think and act differently to both recognize and leverage our collective power.
There is no profits without nonprofits. And I want you to really let that sink in, because that is a bold statement. That is not an opinion. That is a hard fact. There is no profit in America without nonprofits in America. You find me a town that can function without arts and culture, without health care, without education, without a clean environment, and without communities of faith. It's called Death Valley, and it's called Death Valley for a reason. It doesn't work. Now, that's what we're going to talk about today, and it's going to take me just a minute to get there, because this is my last speech as an East Coaster. On Thursday morning, I have just stepped down after 25 years. I'm a founder who let go. After 25 years of leading the DC Central Kitchen, and about 5 of transitioning deliberately out of the day-to-day leadership, so I could function much more on these root causes, I am now going to be moving to Los Angeles, to the region of my youth, where I'm going to be focusing very much of what I did at the DC Central Kitchen, just with a tremendous focus on incredibly healthy food for a rapidly aging poor population. Now, as I leave Washington, there are those who are thrilled at my departure. I have been called, and I very much own this, a loose cannon, a shameless self-promoter, and a bomb thrower. I'm down, true. But if I had to self-choose, I would definitely say I'm bona fide, I'm a futurist, and I'm a tactician. Now, I'm bona fide because, like I said, I've got the numbers to back up what I'm doing. I spent 25 years in the basement of the biggest shelter in America, figuring out a way that you could take food that our society threw away, but more importantly, people our society undervalued, and show the inherent value of each. We took the food that the restaurants, the hotels, the hospitals, the model that City Harvest pioneered here, and we added the dynamic of a job training program. Now, of course, as many of you all know, when I started the DC Central Kitchen, like many founders, it wasn't necessarily something I wanted to do myself. I ran nightclubs. And what I wanted to do was at least say that the restaurants and hotels and food service businesses had a ton of food available every night. And if you could just create a health code approved system, you could rescue millions and millions of pounds. But more importantly, the assumption that if you just took that food and dropped it off a shelter, that somehow a volunteer or an overworked staffer would somehow be able to make heads or tails out of a case of eggplant. That the idea if you had a central hub, you could feed more people better food for less money. Well, again, through job training, you could actually shorten the line by the way you serve the line, but at the same time, do business with the people who donated the food to you by saying, in effect, I'll use your food not just to feed the poor, but I'll prepare men and women who can show up and work with you and help you make more money. It was a deal in which everybody benefited, and I've spent many years working diligently with a tremendous group of people to prove that this model not only works in Washington, but it could work anywhere. We helped 60 other cities develop a model based on this. We have a new project, or I should say they, have a new project called Campus Kitchens, which takes the same idea into university dining halls. There are 60,000 school cafeterias in America that are closed all afternoon, all night, and all weekend. And we've raised an entire generation doing service, yet we still insist they must leave the school and come to the nonprofit. You know, what we always did was just reverse the flow and say, what happens if we took the nonprofit to the school? So there's 33 of those. We generate about 70% of our own income now at the DC Central Kitchen. And while there's many in the room that might be unable to take full advantage of things like social enterprise and microcredit the way we have, that freedom, that economic freedom has given us the power very few organizations have, which is to speak truth to power. Not in a belligerent way, but in a very effective way. But as I suggested earlier, I'm a futurist. Now, I don't know about you all, but the first time I heard that word, I was at a party, and I met somebody in DC's a town, like New York, where people often ask what you do to determine whether you have any value to them and whether you should continue the conversation. And so this person said, he's a futurist, and I was like, dude, what is that? He's like, hey, it's not Star Trek or anything, it's just trends. And it dawned on me, it's like, I'm a futurist then, because I'm mesmerized by trends. What can you see coming? And instead of waiting, do something about it today. I always say there are three kinds of leaders. The majority of our brothers and sisters in the nonprofit sector are members of the first kind of leadership. And again, they have their head down and they are focused on the immediacy of today. I got to make payroll. I got to keep the lights on. And I dig that. That's where most are. And they're stuck there. The second group are people like yourselves. You get a rare moment, come to a gathering to educate yourselves. Look up above the din of daily work. Maybe hear a hungamunga speaker coming in from another city. Now, of the men and women in this select group, and you are select, I mean, when you think about it on a daily basis, how many people can escape, again, the immediacy of just making sure their organization runs? But the majority of people who come to a gathering like this will go home, and they'll either do things just the way they did, and in fact, that's nice, but I can't really do that. And they go right back into that mode of, I can't really, I don't have the time, I might get in trouble. There's 1,000 excuses to go back and do everything you used to. And there are those who might hear in a room like this about the future coming and say, in effect, wow, either A, again, duck and pretend I didn't hear, or brace and wait for the future to come to you. But there's a third kind of leader, and that's what we're going to talk about today. It's the kind of leader who says, no, I refused to accept that future. It is unwritten. Even though it's highly likely, I refuse to accept it. I'm going to march out today. And as crazy as it might sound, I'm going to try and change that future. I'm going to try through the actions I take today to ensure that that bad thing that I don't want to happen doesn't happen. And in my business, and in fact, in many of our human service business, you can see this coming a million miles away. Right now in America, there is a waiting list in half of American cities for Meals on Wheels today. And every single morning, 10,000 people wake up 66 years old. Every single morning, 10,000 people cross that line of 65, and there's 80 million people coming. And you can see what's coming. This is a generation who statistically did not put enough money in the bank to really be prepared for the extra years that science will afford them. So what you can see coming, tragically, is a generation of rapidly aging, very, very poor people. Now again, if you think about it, there's a waiting list now for Meals on Wheels. They can't meet the need now, and there's 80 million people coming. And if you go to the average food bank, what you're seeing is the reality that the era of extra is ending in America. Charity was built on the extra our society produced after World War II when we rebuilt and refed the world. And that produced gargantuan extra, which allowed us the fiction that we could grow charity unlimited and then just keep it going and growing unlimited. We have reached the point where, and the classic place to look at this is go to any pantry, because what you're seeing as the reality is that food that's been donated for decades is lost profit. At the end of the day, all that food, somebody bought it, somebody raised it, somebody grew it, they couldn't sell it, so they donated it to us. And their number one goal is to decrease that. Now, we've gone out of our way at the DC Central Kitchen to make this such an amazing business proposition. But I know what's coming also. When the kitchen first opened and cable television popped up, I saw the advent of the celebrity chef. And I watched because, luckily, I've been coming to New York for so many years. I was going to Ithaca, up to Cornell to speak at the hotel school. And I saw what was two little outposts, Hyde Park with Culinary Institute and Johnson & Wales in Providence were the two major cooking schools. And Cornell and Purdue were the hotel management schools. Well, within 5 years, you were seeing rapid expansion of cooking schools, which meant that what you were going to see very quickly was an army of chefs who were going to come into the business that had been very generous to programs like the DC Central Kitchen and City Harvest and all the food banks and say, I can't believe you throw away all that food. I'm coming out of the school with the best inventory control system money's ever seen, and I can cut that waste in half. That's their job. They're being hired to do that. So unless fundamentally somehow the anti-hunger world really radically changes over the next 5 years, again, we're on a losing proposition. So at one level, the LA Kitchen is about how do we get on the inside and fundamentally try and change things about our delivery system and actually the way we think about our elders. Like you can see what's coming a million miles away, a generation of older people who will look on their handheld and say, let me get this straight. This is my Meals on Wheels meal. No disrespect, but they're going to look at that and they're going to say, that meal will kill me if I eat it. I want super healthy food. I want more vegetarian. I want vegan. I want all kinds of things, but it's not on that plate. So I'm very interested in how we get there. But I'll tell you, I divide my brain 49-51. 49% of my time will always be spent in the glorious world we all inhabit. How can my work today make somebody's life a little bit easier? How can I lessen the load of a fellow citizen, a brother and sister, who's for a variety of different reasons, and I don't care how you ended up there, are in a place where they can't feed themselves or their children that day. That's what we do. But 51% has to be what comes next. Because I know not only will this not work, at the end of the day, my brothers and sisters, it just ain't right. You know, that our solution, and you know, if you had to pick a face of who's hungry in America, it would be easy for someone to suggest and understandable for them to say it's a child. Because the majority of my colleagues will use the face of a child to raise money. You know, but it's not really a child. And even though we don't really know statistically how many elders there are hungry, because what you have now is the prideful generation. Our elders today wouldn't tell you if they were hungry, and they'll say thank you no matter what you bring them. But even if we did studies, it's most likely not a senior. The most likely face of hunger in America is a single woman with kids who works one job or two. And if she's making 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 an hour, she is never going to make it through any 1 month without needing a pantry, a soup kitchen, some program that's going to help her out. That's the face of hunger. And at the end of the day, I don't particularly want to be part of a system that tries to perfect the way in which we feed a working woman leftover food from a restaurant. There must be something else, and that's where I come from, and that's why we're here today to talk. And a lot of things were said this morning, but I want to pick up on the idea of courage, because in just a couple of days, we will celebrate Martin Luther King Day. And too often, and this is where I'm going to start to get a little bit edgy, but too often we take men and women who were flawed humans and make them saints to try and protect the larger group from the power of what they were doing. You know, Dr. King, to go down the long list, Malcolm X, Sojourner Truth, Cesar Chavez, these were people who took tremendous risks. You know, Martin Luther King had firebombs thrown in his home where his children slept. So when we talk about risk, and we kind of put it in the context of I might lose a grant, it's time to rethink our priorities here. Because if we're going to have pictures of Dr. King on our walls and talk all about his legacy, I got to be honest with you, I think Dr. King would recoil at the work I do. Recoil. The notion that somehow we've allowed it to become okay to feed working people in America leftover food from a restaurant. Never ever forget that Dr. King was coming to D.C. to launch the Poor People's Campaign for Economic Justice, not the Poor People's Campaign for more charity or bigger food banks. And somehow we got a little bit lost. So the question becomes, how do we find our way back home? Now, it was mentioned earlier, and I just can't help riff on this for a second, but it was mentioned earlier, why does the non-profit sector behave the way it does? This is my own personal opinion, but I'll tell you, I believe it is the last remnant of gender inequality in America. The nonprofit sector is viewed plain and simple as women's work. And it has been viewed this way since it started. In 1848, in Seneca Falls, women got together and said, we are more than half of the voting population in this country. It is absurd that we are not allowed to have equal access to the voting booths as our husbands and brothers and fathers. And it took 71 years to go from 1848 to the 19th Amendment. We don't have that kind of time, but I want to do this. It's funny, I wrote this down. I did this speech a little while ago. I've only used it once before. I'm going to try it one more time because I think it's fascinating. In 1898, a quote here, women shouldn't be dragged into the dirty pool of politics, for it would surely diminish their capacity to attend to the duties of home. Now, just last year, my good friend Pablo Eisenberg wrote in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, direct political activity would inevitably taint the integrity and public trust of nonprofits, thereby diminishing their capacity to deliver services. Change some words around, my brothers and sisters. We're talking about suffrage. We're talking about half the population's ability to have a say in the process that makes the rules in which we must work. I'll give you another one. Women are by design different in nature, temperament and function. They are noble creatures. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Rhode Island and I heard their state senator say, no, nonprofits are different. You aren't motivated by money. Your work, the work you do, is noble. Again, I'm shocked. This is the third biggest employer in Rhode Island. They are 10% of the state's economy. And they bring billions of dollars into the state from outside of the state. And their state senator, that's all he knew about this organization. The work they do is noble. So I would urge you to consider that what we're doing is a natural progression of both abolition and suffrage. Groups that by their very nature were very different, but they found common ground in Seneca Falls. They knew that they're inevitable, that even though they were different in a million different ways, they were similar in the fact that they were both being subjected by the larger majority. And that's kind of where I want to get to today. Because, right now in New York City and New York State, you all employ here in this state 1/10 of the entire nonprofit employment base nationally. 1.2 million people work in nonprofits. And the reality is, even though there's no data, and I'm going to really push back on the data doesn't matter idea here. Data really does matter. In fact, let's get right to it. Data got President Obama reelected. Because data is when he realized that the Latino and the young population were surging, and that a tactic based on data would yield the votes that were necessary to win the election. It is about data. And the numbers don't lie. The nonprofit sector, we are the major employers in this city, and we are probably one of the major employers in the state. You all are 17% of the state's workforce. But not one of the candidates for governor in your previous election mentioned nonprofits, just as neither candidate for president mentioned nonprofits once. Again, we're the third biggest employer in America, just this close to manufacturing. When you heard them talk over and over and over about manufacturing, not once did they mention the work we do. Now imagine the CEO of any company being called into the board because their shares were dropping precipitously and being asked to develop a vision for the future for how they would regain market share. And in the course of that board meeting, people started to look around and say, they haven't mentioned our third biggest division yet. I guarantee that CEO would be fired. Yet this is the culture we have. And this is the first president who got his first job in a nonprofit. In fact, we were on at the DC Central Kitchen a couple of years ago, right after the president made a speech really detailing the essential need of Americans to create new jobs. We had added 70 new jobs that year. Our social enterprise businesses were exploding, and we were doing one of the most pioneering experiments with locally sourced, cooked-from-scratch meals for DC public schools. 70 jobs, primarily for men and women out of prison. And we only have a 2% recidivism rate for graduates of our program. We start everybody at $13 an hour with full benefits. We're doing all these things, and I thought we gave that White House advance team, again, not a whole bunch, 10 really succinct bullet points. This is who we are. This is an opportunity. And I waited with my fingers crossed, which is the problem. This has been our tactic. But I waited with my fingers crossed, thinking this is going to be the moment where the president walks outside of the DC Central Kitchen. And just as a sidebar, we've been lucky to have many presidents visit since our founding. But there hasn't been one time, in which the press hasn't said the president visited a soup kitchen in Washington, D.C. It wasn't the president visits dynamic business that added 70 new jobs. President visits business that annually the graduates of their job training program earn $2 million in new salaries and pay $225,000 in payroll taxes. Its president visits a soup kitchen. But I thought this time would be different, that this president in particular, again, both he and the First Lady are the first couple who got their first jobs each in nonprofit organizations, that this would be the moment where a president would walk out to the awaiting press corps and say, hallelujah, I've seen the future. I have seen the future, and there are no dots in the future. It's funny, Doug, my good friend here, who teaches over at Columbia, and again, for a guy who barely went to high school and took the word high in high school literally, I was always honored when I got to be invited up to speak at Columbia Business School. But I'm intrigued because no matter where you go in America, no matter what school you go to, you know what they say to the young men and women? And I want to reiterate, a young generation has been raised doing service. This is one of the most amazing social experiments in America. You have an entire generation, 90 million strong, who have been raised doing service. Yet on graduation day, we say, in effect, congratulations, choose. Do you want to make money, or do you want to do good deeds? Do you want to be a .com, or do you want to be a .org? And the glory of what we're talking about is, while it may be difficult to think about the kind of coalitions we're talking about, make no mistake, there's an army of young people who have no interest in this anyway. They can't afford to fund charity as it exists, and they're interested in a solution. And there's 90 million of them. And just as the baby boomers in this room redefined America, so too will a new generation who will not at all be afraid of some of the things that we tremble about. They are natural allies. And not only are they natural allies, but you also have coming, as I alluded to earlier, an army of older people. And it's a wonder, it is a wonder you can't put your head out in a window in the morning and hear a sigh as 10,000 people look in the mirror and see a 67-year-old. You know, think about it. And you know what they're sighing about? How did I get so lost? How did I get so tricked into thinking if I just bought more stuff, I'd be happy? And I don't know about you, but I see them pouring into programs like the DC Central Kitchen every day saying, use me. Use me. Help me make my life manifest here. You know, this is going to be the deepest well of life experience in the history of the world. No other generation will have lived this long and have been this rich and this educated ever. And they're surprisingly interested in many of the same things we are. So we have tremendous allies from outside the nonprofit sector. And that's why one of the reasons I study independence movements. I'm mesmerized by moments where people and leadership rises up. You know, and Gandhi has always fascinated me, as you can imagine. But the thing about Gandhi that fascinated me is I read in a book once that that the British never, ever had more than 3,000 officers ever stationed in India, which means 3,000 white dudes were able to dominate 350 million people on an entire continent for a century and a half. And my father was in the service. One of the reasons I'm going back to Southern California is I was raised around the Marine Corps bases of Southern California. My father was a Marine Corps pilot. So I understand command structure. But still, that really intrigued me. So I went to India a couple years ago really to study the Indian National Congress. What was that magic moment? And it's interesting because Gandhi had a profound idea. And this is really important to our discussion about data because our numbers alone, voters in this city who work in nonprofits, I always say to young people, why on earth occupy the street? Take over the town. You've got the numbers. But Gandhi realized, and this is so much has influenced the way I think, the oppressed and the oppressor are equally afflicted. So much the nonprofit sector is saying, we are all about the oppressed. How can I help the oppressed? Help the oppressed rise up. I guarantee you what Gandhi and most of the liberators discovered long ago, if it is just an insurrection of the oppressed, it is easily put down and forgotten. What you have to do is attract some of the oppressor over to your side. That's why when Gandhi marched to the port city of Dundee, besides saying, and he picked up a handful of salt off the beach, besides saying, in my own country, I just broke the law because I'm not allowed to pick up salt in my own country. I have to buy salt that's imported from the British, from England. Well, hey, look, there's 350 million of us. If we all pick it up, they don't have enough jail cells for us. And for heaven's sakes, even though salt only costs pennies, rupees to buy, there's 350 million of us. It will have an economic impact. He was surrounded by women and untouchables because he's saying it doesn't matter to the British whether you're a Hindu, a Muslim, a Sikh, a man or a woman. They just see us as Indians. You know, at the end of the day, we have more power when we stand together. But the most important thing he was doing was the media. The British media was right in front of him. Because what he was saying, more importantly, was he was saying to the English, this is who you are. Your comfort is purchased by my subjugation. He knew. This is why, when you think about Dr. King, and those images seared in our collective brains of John Lewis being beaten over the head when he crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you know, or young children having dogs and fire hoses, that was that magic moment where suddenly a huge number of the white people who thought in America that only happens in the South, suddenly it became their fight too. These are these magic moments, and I urge us to consider, because we've heard this point made over and over again, what we do binds America together. What we do is deeply rooted in the American experience. De Tocqueville marveled about this when he came to the United States, this amazing connectivity we have that is manifest in philanthropy. You know, again, obviously philanthropy is global, and volunteerism is global. But our unique relationship between government and philanthropy is very unique. Very few governments have a system that incentivizes and rewards people for giving to philanthropy. And I guarantee you no other country in the world has close to 100 million people volunteering on an annual basis, or a percentage of its society like we do. There's tremendous things we have to work with, but we have to cross this big line. And that's the idea that somehow nonprofits are all different and we're too diverse to find common ground. You hear this constantly, and this is such a canard. You know, when the politicians talk about manufacturing, you realize they're talking about IBM, you know, and large companies all the way down to the very smallest. But let's talk about this. What's your name? Valerie. I'm walking down Park Avenue, and I'm going to work because I own Robert's Dry Cleaner. And right across the street is Val's Dry Cleaner. And man, do I hate Val. I hate Valerie. Every morning, I turn the corner and I pray there's either a fire truck or a police car in front of Valerie's. And they're leading her out as she's weeping because she's been caught. There's a fencing operation in back, and Val's finally been busted. Hallelujah, Val's going down. You know? But if the city council was going to somehow regulate small business in a way that was detrimental to Val and I's business, we might not drive down there together. But the Chamber of Commerce or the Board of Trade is where we'd go. And we might end up on a committee together because we knew, again, even though we hated each other, our ability to fight each other to the death was dependent on challenging that law. There are times, there are strategic moments when you let go of your small silo issues, as important as they are to you, to stand together for something bigger. And this is the moment you will have, which is going to be the mayor's race next year. Now, I spent a lot of the past few years trying to figure out how to get the nonprofit sector to be politically engaged. And I must admit, sometimes it's a joy to be revealed to be naive, even at age 55. You know, because I naively thought that nonprofit organizations would pick up the gauntlet. Whether it was the Human Services Coalition, it was all these different groups. I kept thinking the State Association, that these are the groups that should be political. But reality is, it's difficult for a variety of levels. Either there's the fear, unfounded as it might be, that, you know, Senator Grassley and the IRS will come and steal your children in the night, you know, if you even remotely think of being politically active. Then there's the understandable concern that the funders will be mad at you too, or the equally legitimate concern that the victor, if you supported the candidate that lost, that there would be somehow retaliation. Those are all legitimate, and I get that. But the reality is, staying where we're at now, again, as I've said many times, what we're doing now doesn't work. We must fundamentally, not only for us, but for our communities. You know, so now is this moment. Now, to be honest with you, I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I had a real eureka moment, and we have some tremendous tools to work with right now that we've never, ever had before. Because what See Forward is about, which is an advocacy organization I founded last year, along with the PAC. I haven't used the PAC yet, but I just want to have that availability. In fact, as I'm going to get further into See Forward, and believe me, just so you know, I'm not here to sell See Forward. I'm just here to talk about tactics and the ones we're employing. But I think it's legitimate. See Forward is about the employees of the nonprofit sector, the private citizens, using their First Amendment, their rights as private citizens, to use their personal Twitter account and their personal Facebook accounts to relentlessly pursue candidates to speak openly about the economic reality of what we contribute. The reality is, as surprising as it may be, and it would be an interesting test to ask Mayor Bloomberg. I mean, from a philanthropic point of view, the gentleman is probably one of the most generous individuals there is in America. I think he gave like $400 million last year to charity. And of course, he presides over a city that is most likely one of the few cities in which the nonprofit sector is. And I was looking frantically for where I got this, because about 5 months ago, somebody said that the nonprofit sector is the #1 employer in New York City. And I've been looking feverishly to find out where that was, but I guarantee if you're not #1, you're in the top 3. I guarantee you. But I wonder if the mayor could tell you exactly how many nonprofits work in the city, how many people they employ, how much payroll taxes they pay. But more importantly, and I think this is really important, how much money does the nonprofit sector bring in from outside the city into the city? Because what you represent, whether we know it or not, that you all are probably one of the biggest sources of outside investment in New York City. So again, not only do you create the foundation upon which all profit needs. Again, businesses can't run in streets that are, again, without all the services we provide. Not only that, but we bring a gargantuan sum of money. And you want good data? That's the data you need to find. How much money do these organizations bring in from outside the city? Because that makes any mayor's dream come true. And let's get down to it. What's the goal here? The goal should be that in a few weeks, a few months, when all the candidates for mayor stand before you all, that they're fighting each other for your vote. They're saying, in effect, nonprofit sector in New York, if you work at a nonprofit in New York City, I want to be your mayor. And I got a bold vision for how we're going to work together because, again, I understand the new civic mathematics. I understand that both for-profit and nonprofit are equally essential to any economic recovery plan out there. And if any of my candidates, any of my competitors try and tell you they've got an economic recovery plan that does not include one of the biggest employers, one of the biggest sources of payroll taxes, one of the biggest sources of outside investment, I wouldn't vote for them to be dog catcher of this town. And that's the reality. They should be out there saying, in effect, I want to be your mayor. If you elect me mayor, I'll put together a council, if you will, on philanthropy. I think, personally, want to see forward its goals. Every single mayor, every single governor should have a deputy mayor, lieutenant governor of philanthropy and service. And there's 5 things that I think would make incredibly smart sense. One, good data. The fact that nobody can tell you how much money the nonprofit sector generates, how much money they bring in, that's really crazy. In this economic recovery time, the notion that one of the biggest employers in this city, no one has really good, solid data. In fact, try and find data on the nonprofit sector. It's actually very tough. Lester Salomon at Johns Hopkins has done tremendous work. But usually his data is 2, if not 3 years old because they have to go back and look through the 1990s. We do not have quarterly data on the work we do, and that's really wrong. Secondly, and I know many of you all work for contracts, but I'll tell you, I think the power of government doing more and more contracts, not just with nonprofits, but I think more and more social enterprise organizations. As I suggested earlier, the DC Central Kitchen, when we started seeing more and more felons come in, that no matter how good we trained them, no one was going to hire a felon. Well, we did what we had to do. We adapted, and we became an employer. So imagine for us to go to the city and say we added 70 jobs, we'd have to add 70 more. And again, paying a good wage, providing benefits, and giving jobs to men and women who, were it not for a program like this, would hire a felon, would go back to prison after they hurt somebody or robbed a business. And then they would go back and cost us $42,000 a person. What you want is a mayor who says, what do I have to do to get you to grow? What kind of resources do you need? So again, mayors that really understand the power of organizations like this, because by our very nature, again, we don't make profit to be redistributed in dividends. We reinvest our profit over and over and over again. We're a mayor's dream come true. They just don't see us that way. They live like most people do, in this antiquated, bifurcated notion that to drive the economy you need businesses, while charities do good deeds and follow the parade with a broom. That's pretty much our job. And we have to just help them understand. So there is a dynamic of traditional advocacy, which is education. How do you help candidates understand what we contribute? But also, how do we get to the point where, again, they're actually vying for our votes? I want to go back and I want to finish up this idea of what a point person on philanthropy could do. Again, the idea of good, solid data. Lowering the bar for nonprofits to get contracts, but expediting the reimbursement process so that nonprofits don't go broke waiting for reimbursement by the city or the state. Third, social enterprise. Microcredit. How can any program that wants to launch a new business that's going to employ women out of a domestic violence shelter, a variety of different people, how can we create those jobs ourselves? Housing is a great example, and I don't want to be proven ignorant, but traditionally in many American cities, this tactic for getting workforce housing is we hope that government coerces developers to build a few units of set-asides to get access to a piece of property they want. I want to talk for a second. This is the problem with coming early, is I'm so flooded with ideas and trying so hard to get it out in this very small amount of time. Let me finish that before I go to mergers. The idea of social enterprise and microcredit, very much the idea of doubling the amount of money nonprofits bring into the city from outside the city. Mayor Hickenlooper, who's now the governor of Colorado, opened the Office of Strategic Partnerships. And they brought in almost $400 million over the last 10 years. A very small staff was able to access a huge amount of new money just by helping organizations apply for a grant, find collaboration, sometimes even merging, but they facilitated that. They made it happen. And then finally, volunteerism. Interesting enough, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger was the first governor in America to appoint a volunteer dedicated liaison on his cabinet, knowing in effect that there will someday be a catastrophe in the state of California and not wanting to wait till the next day to try and organize what could be an amazing army of people who are ready to roll up their sleeves and use their professional skill, their know-how, their love of the state to help rebuild. So those are the 5 things that I think a smart mayor would really be after, and I think even more so a smart sector would be pushing them for. I wrote a couple of months ago, purposely trying to make a point, that the most important word for the nonprofit sector this year was merger. Right? And I use that word purposely because I knew instinctively that it would generate a huge amount of wincing, and people would immediately, because again, I want to really reiterate this, when we talk, where do we immediately go in the nonprofit sector? We go to a place of weakness. Oh, merger, he means because times are tough, 2 need to become 1. That is immediately where the majority of people who even saw the headline of what I wrote went. And I wanted that to be Exhibit A because it reveals why we're in the place we are. We immediately think we're weak. But what I really meant was that, sure, 2 become 1 isn't illegitimate. We all know there's duplication in every city, in every corner, and there's a legitimate discussion for that. But let's take a few different layers, a few other levels of mergers that I think are important. State associations, or associations like this. Where best practices, shared purchasing power, but more importantly, imagine, and I know it's been done in many other situations, where if all the members got together and gave the Human Services Coalition the money they needed to hire a full-time advocate at City Hall. Every single day, somebody was down at City Hall or up in Albany, every single day. And all they did was fight for your issue. That's the strength of an association. The third level that I find even more interesting is the idea of banking. Do you realize that the nonprofits in this city, and just in this room, if you all got together and said, collectively, what are our budgets? How much money do we wash through different banks? And what would happen if we merged our banking business? Not our assets, just our business. And we farmed it out. Which bank wants our combined billions of dollars in annual revenue? If you do, that's great, but we want a seat on the board. We want access to capital. We want to be able to escape the grant cycle. Do you realize collectively the nonprofit sector in America is bigger than Bank of America? For heaven's sakes, why do we have to go and constantly beg for money for workforce housing when we could become developers ourselves? We could issue credit cards and not be predators on the people we serve. We could actually help people rise up and go and gain their own economic strength. And it's just a matter of thinking collectively. I'll give you another great level. Imagine if the New York City or New York State nonprofits, or imagine if all nonprofits got together and we created a seal of approval. Now I want to go back to the work I do. If I know that at the end of the day, the men and women who come to the DC Central Kitchen or any program that provides food, the majority of them are working, but they're just not making enough in wage. What would happen if we said to the 90 million people who volunteer at charity every year, we got an idea. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Really, we did great work today. But the reality is we could volunteer for another 1,000 years, and we might not fundamentally make a real big difference. But when you leave here and you go to shop every day, look for our seal of approval. Because the collective nonprofits of this city, this state, this country, we get together, and these are the businesses that every time you shop there, you're decreasing the need for us. Every time you shop at this business, these are businesses that pay a good wage, that have certifiable green policies, provide health care, or reinvest in the community. Imagine the future, and whether you know it or not, the future of philanthropy is everyday commerce. That is the only sustainable thing. We have tried to make this run on checks at the end of the year and budget the surplus that's deemed left over in the budgets. The future is going to be daily commerce. And trying to say to consumers where you shop either increases the need for our services and the human services or decreases. And it's your choice. If you like paying higher taxes, if you like all the things that we're having to struggle constantly to do, fine, shop at these stores. No bad. But if you really fundamentally want to see a change, look for our seal. But the highest level of merger is our votes. And this is where I think we need to be incredibly strategic. Because again, I want to really reiterate, imagine the power of the collective nonprofits of this city in the upcoming mayor's race. And let me tell you how this will work. Where did I put it? Oh, it's right here. We've never had the ability before to use this. This right here, this is the press conference that never ends. Seriously, think about this. If I was the mayor or a candidate and I was standing up here and it's a press conference, and I knew that you're going to be the one asking, Val's going to be the one that's going to ask the pointed question, so I'm never going to answer her hand going up. But even if she somehow gets up and says something, I can say, Val, I love nonprofits. Nonprofits are the backbone of New York City. Thank you very much. And off he went. He or she went. Well, the reality is we have the ability right now, because during the last presidential election, and I guarantee you every election right now, the candidates all have somebody on their staff that is monitoring their Twitter feed every single moment of every single day. And the ability of thousands of citizens of New York City saying we are the biggest employer in the city, we are major sources of outside investment, we are a major conduit of the volunteer energy of thousands of New Yorkers. What is your economic recovery plan? What's our role in it? Period. Send. And if 10,000 people a day do that over and over and over, they can't not answer. And I want to go back to the oppressed and the oppressor. When it comes to public education, what we need to be able to do is help regular New Yorkers understand that when they hear the word nonprofit, that they leave behind the notion that we don't create anything of value. You know, we create the best profit in America. The kind of things that our country should be justifiably proud that they help engender every day when they give their time or their money or their votes. You know, this is something we really need people to understand, that the fight we have is not just because the nonprofits want to have their little piece of the pie or we want to be another special interest group up in Albany. No, fundamentally what we're trying to do is to usher in a new economic era where people really truly start to understand that the new civic mathematics of nonprofit and for-profit together, that's the only way we are going to be able to rebuild America in a way that doesn't just empower a few, but truly elevates us all. Thank you very, very much. Yeah. I've allowed a little bit of time here in case anybody wants to say, are you crazy? Go west, young man. No, I got to tell you, it's hard. You know the hardest part about going west? Is I can't wear black anymore. I'll fry. Thoughts, comments on this? Politics. Any big disagreements? What do you all think of that idea about the gender roots of philanthropy? I agree. I mean, honestly, I've tried to be very respectful. I'm a white man in America. The last thing I want to do is start preaching. But I'll tell you, I've tried very hard to understand, because I'm just like you all. I couldn't figure out, why does the sector behave the way it does? Why are we always in a place of weakness? Why are we submissive so often? And I think oftentimes what you discover, sometimes when you look back through the lens of history, it's confusing. How on earth could, again, 3,000 officers of the British Army control 350 million people? It seems crazy through the lens of history, but it takes that strategic moment where people stop and say, no more. And that's one of the reasons I always love coming to New York, because, I mean, you know, this is the place. This is the place in the revolution where people said, freedom? What's freedom? It's a handful of rich white dudes get that freedom. Nobody was free in America back then. Freedom was an abstract idea, but what is it that got people to suddenly stop, put down their plow, pick up their musket, take probably their oldest son, and say to their wife and what remaining children, good luck. I hope I come back, but this is important. And they left. You know, what was it? Again, think about that. The idea that you could get people of color in the South to stop and say, if we don't ride the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, we can make something happen. Imagine when the Filipino migrant workers in California, in Delano, went on strike. And Cesar Chavez said, in effect, you've got your coalition and I've got mine. Let's put them together and create the United Farm Workers, because only when we stand together will we have a chance. And the notion that they could confront land ownership in the Central Valley with grapes, the grape boycott. You know, the notion that pennies of poor people could actually challenge the authority of the perceived rich. All three men, Gandhi, King, and Chavez, salt, dimes, and grapes, revealed that even, it doesn't matter how poor you are, when you stand together, the illusion is revealed. See, nobody even asked me a question and I went off on a tangent.
That concludes this segment of the Double Down Conference. Stay tuned to CUNY TV, which will have further installments on Double Down, and visit the Baruch Digital Media Library for archives of this and other Baruch College events.